I'll give it a go now. Are you able to see that?
Yes, it's come through. So whenever you're ready, just go ahead.
Okie doke. So welcome everyone, and thank you all for coming along to my talk today. I'll be talking about a research project of mine which has been investigating the variable social support as a potential facilitator of meat reduction efforts. So just to give you a little bit of background and sort of rationale for this project, eating is a deeply social activity. The vast majority of us eat in the company of other people, be it our family members, our friends, or our partners. And eating together helps to facilitate social bonding, and particularly eating the same food. That helps to define group norms and group rules. And meat in particular has huge social cultural value. So consider our traditional practices like Christmas Day dinner and turkey there being centre of the table, but also in our social practices as well. So consider the summertime barbecue, all of us gathered round the barbecue as we share in burgers and hot dogs and the like. But the production and consumption of animal-derived food products has been linked really to a mass of negative consequences, harming human health, exacerbating issues of social injustice, for example, water scarcity, but also world hunger, and contributing to environmental damage and also climate change. But giving up meat is not easy, and of course with its huge social cultural value, a lot of people struggle to give up meat or at least reduce their consumption of meat. And in a recent OnePoll survey, it was found that around 2/3 of British men say that they would simply rather die 10 years early than ever have to give up their consumption of meat. So given that giving up meat represents a real challenge for many people, a lot of research within psychology has turned to understand some of the barriers that stand in people's ways when it comes to reducing their consumption of meat. And one barrier that this research tends to converge on is this anticipated lack of social support. So support from our family and our friends in making such a transition towards a more plant-based diet, if not entirely plant-based itself. And in a paper entitled "If I Became Vegan, my family and friends would hate me," these authors conducted a number of focus groups, and they found that social support for many people represented a real barrier in making such a transition to a reduced meat diet. And this is found in many different studies. In one paper, there was around 25% of participants who agreed that social support represented a significant barrier for them. But also on the flip side, so people who go vegan and then return to their omnivorous diet, around 40% of those people reference a lack of social support as being one of the reasons why their vegan diet failed. So this led us to our research question. If social support oftentimes comes up as being a real barrier in the self-report literature, could we experimentally manipulate felt social support, and would that then lead to a facilitative effect for meat reduction efforts? And we had a number of hypotheses around this research question, but in relation to the talk that I'll give today, I'll focus mainly on this variable of social support. And here we expected that felt social support would lead to greater performance on a meat-free pledge, as measured by a number of different outcomes. So in terms of our methodology and how we went about testing this question, we had 249 participants who were invited to come along to a briefing session held over Microsoft Teams. And the briefing session had a number of purposes. Firstly, to detail the method that participants were about to engage in. It also entailed a number of consent procedures and also surveys. But what we had participants do in the briefing session was to invite them to take part in a meat-free pledge, and specifically a pledge to eat one vegetarian meal a day, every day, for a period of 14 days. Now, participants were asked to do this under one of three experimental manipulations. They were either asked to take part in the pledge entirely on their own, or with members of, or with other participants who were present on the Microsoft Teams call. And these were usually groups of 3 to 4. And these participants went on and shared a social space in Microsoft Teams, a group that was private to them and a group that they could engage with one another through. And it also afforded them the ability to provide each other with social support should the need arise at any point during the pledge. And in our final condition, we had participants take part in this pledge with members of their household. So typically in groups of around 2 to 6, we had couples and also groups of friends. These participants were collected from a pool of Lancaster University students. So unfortunately, our household condition didn't capture family groups and was predominantly restricted to couples or friendship groups. All participants, regardless of condition, then entered into a 14-day period of pledging and smartphone-based experience sampling, and that was using the Metricwire app. In blue, you see the surveys that participants had to answer each day. They had 3 surveys, one that came through at 11 AM and asked them for their intention to pledge. So just a simple binary, do you intend to pledge, yes or no? At 6 PM, participants then completed a food consumption diary with important meat-based items on that diary, and then a pledge completion question as well, very similar to the intention question at 11 AM, just a simple binary, yes or no, did you successfully complete your pledge? I have a little camera image there just to remind me to also say that those participants who did complete their pledge were also asked to upload an image of their vegetarian meal. And that was as both an honesty measure, but also to be included in our data analysis. And at the moment, these images are currently being coded by a team of raters. This period of smartphone-based experience sampling was then sandwiched between a series of surveys which make up our longitudinal data. We had a baseline survey taken during the briefing session, and then a post-intervention survey in a couple of days following the pledge, and a 2-week follow-up survey 2 weeks after the post-intervention survey. Now, in terms of what we were asking for at these 3 time points, at baseline, we had participants complete a series of standard demographic items, but also the meat commitment scale, and higher scores on this scale indicate a stronger commitment to the consumption of meat. Across all 3 surveys, we also had participants complete a 24-hour recall food consumption survey, which made up our behaviour measure for this longitudinal data. We then had participants complete a meat-veggie IAT, and in this meat-veggie IAT, positive scores indicate a preference for meat-based dishes, and negative scores a preference for veggie dishes. We also had participants complete an intention scale, and this was made up of motivation-based items and also capacity-based items. And together, higher scores indicate a higher intention for long-term meat reduction. And this whole procedure spanned around a month for each participant, and each participant was paid either £15 in cash for participation, or they received 8 credits through the SONA system. In terms of what we find from the Metricwire data, first of all, we had a look to see whether we had successfully manipulated felt social support, and we did this using a number of manipulation check questions. What we see is that felt social support was successfully manipulated in our household condition, although not so much so for our teams in Microsoft Teams. What you see here is that most participants in the Microsoft Teams group failed to engage, 79 of them indicating that they never engaged with their group on Microsoft Teams. And you also see significant differences between these four ratings in the table below. So all participants were asked to indicate how interactive their group was, how supportive their group was, how much they enjoyed interacting with their group, and the benefit that they felt from taking part in a pledge within a group. Household participants rated these items significantly higher than those in the Microsoft Teams groups, indicating that they had felt some level of social support, whereas those in Microsoft Teams hadn't. So something to bear in mind as we walk through the analysis. We also see that participants had quite an easy time of completing their pledge, and this is really important in the context of commitment devices. There's a lot of literature which suggests that pledges and commitment devices like these ought to be quite challenging in order for participants to reflect on what the pledge means for them as a person, and then to internalize that and from that see some longitudinal behavior changes. Each participant completed a question at the top there. How easy or difficult did you find it to complete your pledge today? And they completed that each day across the 14 days. On a 1 to 5 scale, with 1 representing extremely easy, we see that the average ease was around 1.76, so somewhere between extremely easy and very easy. And we don't see any significant differences there between groups. We also see from the intention and completion data that in 97% of cases, participants indicated a positive response to this question, so indicating, yes, I intend to pledge today. And in around 90% of cases, we see that that then translates to a pledge completion. When participants failed to complete their pledge, what we see is that most of them quote practical barriers for their reason of failing to complete the pledge. So things relating to having already defrosted a portion of meat and therefore the meat needing to be eaten, or simply that they have meat that is about to go off and so therefore it needed to be eaten, or having no vegetarian alternatives in the house and not having gone shopping yet. This makes up some of the qualitative data that we've got from the study, and there is a little bit more data than I've included in this presentation. Qualitative data in response to the infographics that participants received, and also in relation to their intention measure. So when a participant didn't intend, they're also asked, why is it that you aren't able to intend today? And what we see in the pledge is that highly committed meat eaters tend to consume more meat during the pledge, which is quite intuitive and something that we did anticipate to see here. But we didn't see any other differences in terms of pledge performance between our group condition. So social support not holding up as a significant variable within this data set. Moving on then to our longitudinal findings, what we see is that meat consumption is significantly reduced at outtake, but seems to return to a baseline level 2 weeks later. So you see there at baseline, participants report eating an average of 1.8 portions of meat, and at outtake in the days following the pledge, that has dropped down to around 1.4. And then that returns 2 weeks later to around 1.6, which is a score not significantly different from baseline. So we see this sort of inverse relationship where meat consumption returns back to an original level that was picked up at baseline. In terms of intentions to reduce, we see that they remain the same between baseline and outtake. So no change in explicit attitudinal measures between our baseline and outtake, but they are significantly reduced 2 weeks later. So maybe a backfire effect is something of what we're seeing here. And again, we see that highly committed meat eaters consume more meat. They also have lower intentions to reduce their consumption of meat. And they also have higher implicit positivity scores for meat-based dishes as picked up in the IAT. And we see the same patterns are true for men as well. So relative to females, men tend to eat more meat. They also report having lower intentions to reduce their consumption of meat and higher implicit positivity for meat-based dishes. And then in terms of our social support variable, these are the findings that fall out from our modelling. Participants in the group condition, and when I say group condition, I'm referring to the Microsoft Teams groups, tend to consume more meat than those in the household condition. And participants in the group condition have lower intentions to reduce than those in the lone condition. So what we're seeing here is that participants in the Microsoft Teams groups seem to perform the least well relative to the other conditions, although the differences here change in terms of the outcome variable that we're looking at. So just to conclude, it seems as though our pledge request was too easy. And as I touched on earlier, a challenging pledge request is important for picking up long-term behavioural change, as according to previous literature. Because our pledge request was too easy, we weren't able to work with the data from our Metricwire data set, so the data referring to intention and completion, we didn't see enough variability there to be able to model those data. And so in future, we'll probably look at making our pledge request a little bit more challenging. And in this study, we confirmed a lot of what we already know about meat reduction. So for example, that highly committed meat eaters tend to eat more meat, tend to intend to reduce less, and also have higher implicit positivity for meat-based dishes, and the same true for men. And our study doesn't seem to show any support for the added value of social support. So we see that those in the Microsoft Teams group simply didn't reach out for the support from the people who were sort of there to provide that for them. They didn't use their group throughout the pledge. And that might be a result of the pledge request being too easy, or it might be that they simply didn't feel as though they needed social support, perhaps from a group of strangers or just full stop. And we also see that those in this condition tend to perform the least well out of those in the other conditions, so those in the lone and those in the household condition. Now, it might be that social support is an artifact of self-report methods. So a lot of the research that this study is built upon has been conducted using self-report method, and that might just be you know, a bias that you see typical of these type of designs. Or it might be that we weren't able to capture social support in its true essence. And these are really the questions that this project has sort of left me with. Is it the case that because we use participants from a student sample, that we weren't truly able to capture social support in its true essence? Would this be a different story if we looked at family groups and, you know, typical household groups? So yeah, that sort of wraps everything up for my talk. Thanks everyone for listening. Just want to say a quick thank you to my supervisory team, Dr. Jared Piazza and Dr. Ryan Boyd. and all of the participants that took part in this study and provided excellent data included the images that you see there to the right.
All right, thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you.
We have a few questions for you here. So the first one reads, interesting stuff. What was the motivation for participants engaging with the meat-free pledge beyond the experimental paradigm? For example, had they expressed desires to reduce meat consumptions prior to the experiment?
Great question, and something that has definitely been covered off in the literature before. So in this study, we didn't actually disclose that the study was going to include a meat-free pledge. So those participants who signed up to take part in the study actually signed up to take part in a 14-day period of smartphone sampling. And then when they came along to the briefing session, they were invited to take part in this pledge. And so that the aim of the project was then revealed, if you will. So participants didn't come with a prior motivation, and all of the participants in the study were omnivores, some reducing their consumption in some way. We had around 30 semi-vegetarians, so some with slight more experience in reducing meat. But nobody came with the motivation to take part in a pledge, if you will. So yeah, a totally unmotivated sample. Yeah,
great. We have a question from Kim here who says, very interesting topic. How heavily weighted is perceived support in comparison to other factors that may influence someone's transition to a plant-based diet? For example, education regarding the negative consequences of eating an omnivorous diet, and where factors like this controlled for?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Kim. I mean, the literature is really littered with different barriers to reducing, and there's a nice review of those barriers in a paper, I think, by Gregson et al. I can share that with you if you'd like, Kim. It's a good paper, and it covers off a lot of the different factors that sort of stand in people's way. And like you mentioned with information, that's a huge factor there. Awareness is a real barrier to reducing. And yet even some of the literature suggests that with increased awareness, people may well intend to reduce, but that often doesn't translate into behaviour change. And so the following study that will sort of lead on from this project, using very similar methods, will look at awareness raising in a tailored fashion. So tailoring information messages to a person's stage of behaviour change. In this study, we did include information just so as to cover off that motivation barrier. So all participants received information about the reasons why we should be reducing our consumption of meat, and also capacity-based information, so how we can go about reducing our consumption of meat. And that was just to create like a holistic paradigm so that participants sort of had everything that they needed, which may well be a reason why we don't see all that much variability in the outcomes, because everyone was supported in the same way. But yeah, there are a number of different barriers, including habit, low perceived capacity, limited agency, and things I would absolutely love to look at using this same paradigm, and hopefully we'll do very soon.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you again, Rebecca. We're going to move on to Megan, but thank you again.
Thank you
very much. All right, so we have a few minutes before Megan's talk. So if you want to grab a coffee, you can do that real quick, and we'll come back 2:40.